Hey there, it's me Olivia. Welcome to my channel. Today we are going to share a story called The Hidden Heir's Shocking Transformation by Brandy. For more interesting and exclusive stories, please subscribe to my channel and visit my Patreon page for early access, link in the description. It was nearly so. When he released me, I had so little breath that I swayed where I stood, clutching now from physical need more than emotional. Somewhere in there my eyes opened, when had they closed, and I saw his bemused grin from such a tantalizing close distance. Now I have an incentive to win, he smiled. After that kiss I know that you do not hate me. Promise me that you won't hate me when Dron lies dead. Oh, Leonidas, don't do this. Dron is a fearsome warrior. I couldn't bear it if you were killed. Dear Charisse, sweet Charisse, fear only for Dron. You have not seen me fight. It was not bragging, the way he said it. His voice had the confidence that Hugh of Sandar's would use to declare that the agenda for a council meeting had been accomplished. It was a simple fact within his expertise, and the entire idea of error was simply silly. Leonidas gathered up his inadequate sword and waved me out of his tent as casually as if we were going to the picnic our carriage ride had suggested. I was not nearly so casual. If Leonidas had chosen to pursue a path designed to create the most possible conflict within me, he could have selected none more effective. Dron was my vassal and I owed him my loyalty. Leonidas was my enemy and it was my duty to repel his land's invasion of ours. But Leonidas was also my... What? He escorted me back to the carriage and up beside Mother. I was unaware of any of this, too lost in my internal turmoil to notice where I was. She saw my confusion and let me sit for a moment, but she interrupted my thoughts when the two men squared off. You had better watch this, dear. I lifted my head to see the men approach each other, the one I owed loyalty to and the one I owed nothing to. Right? It was that easy, simple. One was an Achaean and one was from High Canyon. But dear God, one was Leonidas. Dron waited patiently, crouched behind his shield, his broadsword cocked behind his shoulder for a slashing attack that I knew for a fact could cut through a 3-inch tree. It would take a leg or arm from Leonidas without even losing significant speed. Leonidas approached lightly, the leonine grace that his name promised very evident in his gliding stride. It never seemed that all his weight was on either foot, yet still he made swift progress toward his opponent. I wanted to call out to Leonidas, to warn him, but I couldn't. I knew that Dron had developed a devastating initial attack, taking an unexpected short step to allow him to reach an opponent who still considered himself safe. I had seen him knock down strong fighters with that first blow. In all the times I had watched, only King Andros and Prince Tamer were strong enough to withstand the blow without being driven to their knees, and only Berith had ever fully avoided it. But even Berith had fallen victim to the move the first time he had seen it. As Leonidas neared the deadly distance from Dron, my eyes began to fill with unwanted tears. This man whose touch in my hair could bring my heart to my throat, whose kiss could steal my very life away and welcome to it, would soon lie dead. Yet I could not warn him. Dron was a son of Achaea, my vassal. I had to just watch as he executed a man my heart did not know how to live without. Dron launched his attack. The quick short step and powerful swing reached out for Leonidas' knee, which wasn't there. Leonidas had shifted his position in a way that I didn't really understand. It hadn't looked like a real step, more of a shuffle, though that word is entirely too graceless for the smooth flow. Instead of suffering a destroyed knee, his own sword reached out to nick at Dron's arm through a small gap between armor sections. It looked trivial, but I noticed a stain of blood begin to spread. Dron followed up his initial move with power and surprising speed. Like a spring coiling and uncoiling, his sword would accelerate toward Leonidas, slow after it had swung past, then accelerate back. His shield covered his body well, and I knew why he had survived the recent war. Yet, Leonidas and Dron's sword never seemed to be in the same place at the same time. It sometimes looked as though the sword had passed through Leonidas like he was thick smoke, yet a part of my mind registered the fact that Leonidas had moved back, then forward behind the stroke to make another stinging jab. None of Dron's wounds were serious, but each drew its own toll of blood. It might not even have mattered that Dron was bleeding. No one human could sustain for long the energy of Dracen's attack. Soon the very weight of armor that protected him became a deceitful trap, slowing him ever more. He tried to retreat, but no matter which way he faced, Leonidas was somehow able to reach in from another angle to strike once more. I knew it was over when I saw Dracen's shield arm droop for a moment. He lifted it even before Leonidas could take advantage of the lapse, but he would soon be too tired to protect himself. I couldn't bear to watch it, but I didn't dare turn away and betray my lack of confidence in my soldier. Mother saw my distress and leaned over. It is hard, dear, I know, but Dracen's sacrifice is no less part of winning Achaea back than was Baratha's or even King Andros. And so it was. When the time finally came that Dracen could no longer defend himself, Leonidas actually stepped back a few paces and saluted the tired soldier with an elegant flourish. But his next stroke unerringly found a hole in the armor under Dracen's sword arm that the shield was just too low to protect. He collapsed like a falling tree, dead of a burst heart before even the pull of the earth could claim him. Leonidas showed no pleasure at this. He saluted the dead man once again, wiped his sword on Dracen's tunic in a ceremony I didn't understand, but which seemed more gracious than proud, then nodded to Queen Celia and me. At her responsive nod, he turned back into his pavilion. Mother settled back into her seat with heartbreaking heaviness, closing her eyes immediately after catching the driver's attention to let him know to return us to the castle. I felt much the same, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from the pavilion. Did I see Leonidas watching as we drove away, or had I just imagined it? With eyes still closed, Mother said, I think you need to visit our people in North Vale for a short while, before the winter snow set in. Excuse me? I replied. I think you should leave the castle for a while, she explained. And leave Leonidas alone with Julia? I heard my mouth cry. Convicted by my own lips in more ways than words, I knew Mother was right even as she denied the worry my heart had expressed. No, she will accompany you. It will be hard on you both, for you will be imprisoned in your maiden's lovers until you return. Yet, I think you must get away from Leonidas for a time. Yes, Mother, I answered, then leaned back into my own seat. Such a simple, dutiful response. In part, I was too torn by the conflict within me to argue, regardless of the topic. But I also knew she was wise in her decision. I definitely was not ready for more time alone with Leonidas, no matter how much a part of me wanted the opportunity. We went down to a less formal supper than most, yet more formal as well. The day's trial had made everyone stiffly polite, using manners to bridge over the trust that had been lost. Even in that I saw Mother's hand. She did not want trust between Achaea and High Canyon. Unlike our typical practice, and this was a sign of that lack of trust, we women took our places without formal escort, arriving at the dining room by ourselves. Leonidas arrived shortly thereafter. I never knew if he went to our rooms looking for us or had on his own decided to allow us to come by ourselves. Regardless, as soon as he saw us already there, he moved to his own seat with his accustomed languid grace. His eyes were solemn, though. The lazy humor that he often used to conceal the sharpness of his wit was absent that evening. Julia, who had not come to the execution, was the only one showing strong emotion, and her emotion was anger. I saw her about to say something to Leonidas, something hurtful, but I put my hand on her arm to stop her. That almost earned me the attack she had intended for Leonidas, but when she saw my face she subsided. Instead of a loudly voiced insult, she leaned close to whisper to me, but her question was interrupted by Queen Celia. "My Lord Regent, I must beg a favor of you," she began. A suspicious light came into his eyes. When he first arrived in our castle, I expect he would have extended an open promise at such a request. Now, though, he merely nodded. It is appropriate for a royal inspection of our new key barony at North Vale. The trip, especially at this time of year, will be somewhat extended, perhaps even a month in duration. Princess Charisse will go, but the recent conflict has left us without appropriate officers for her escort. I need to ask you to provide an officer from High Canyon. I will go myself, Leonidas offered instantly. As you wish, my Lord Regent, Queen Celia replied calmly, then continued, but you, Yourself have asked for reports on the new forging process. Will you delay that activity until your return? Oh, yes, and that involves General Raynal as well, Leonidas remembered. He will be responsible for implementing the new procedure in High Canyon. Very well, Strain shall lead the escort, Leonidas decided without further hesitation. As you wish, Queen Celia repeated, this time offering no concerns. Who else will go? Julia asked, though her eyes were on me. I nodded, even as Mother announced the content of the party. It would consist of myself, Julia, my servant Mina, and such soldiers as Strain felt appropriate. Actually, that turned out to be the list only of those with rank or significant responsibilities. In fact, when we would finally set out the next day, Julia and I each had several additional attendants. Our impending departure put an additional damper on the mood of the evening. We soon broke up. As we left, Queen Celia indicated that both Julia and I were to accompany her. When we reached Mother's chambers, she caught Grey Shadow up into her arms before speaking. Girls, I am sorry for doing this to you. I spent one extended journey in my maiden's lover when I still wore it, and it is not a pleasant memory. You will need to help each other throughout the trip in most demeaning and intimate duties that can nonetheless not be trusted to anyone else. Are you prepared to do this? Of course, there could be only one answer. Julia and I nodded in unrehearsed unison. Majesty, why are we doing this? Julia asked. It is necessary for both of you to be out of the castle for a time, Mother began, but then she continued, and there is now another reason. Strain must not survive the trip. This dramatic order was delivered with no more emotion than Queen Celia had used to accept Leonidas' decision to assign Strain to the duty. It was as though it didn't matter to her, and I realized that in large part this was the case. Leonidas had unknowingly passed sentence of death on Strain by naming him to head our escort. Once again, Mother had set up the situation through her claim of inadequate availability of Achaean commanders without targeting a specific individual. Yet, it was no great stretch of the imagination to recognize that Leonidas had scarcely had a choice. His own officers were limited now that Alrin was dead. Only Julia's face showed surprise at our new task. God forgive me, but I saw the necessity even as Mother was wording her command. Do you have a plan for how we are to accomplish this? I asked. Not specifically, but in general, yes, Queen Celia answered. Strain is obviously intended for Julia. I suggest you tease him and Julia can defend him. It will appear as though his approaches are finally meeting with some success. I think, Julia, you might even manage to let him kiss you, as you allowed Leonidas. I'm sure he will report this. Julia looked puzzled. I don't understand. Queen Celia sighed and began to speak, but I interrupted her with an insight that I knew must be correct. By the time this happens, or at least soon after, the autumn rains will come to North Vale. After Strain has an opportunity to report his progress, when no suspicion will fall on you, he will slip on a wet stare, or you will find it necessary to ask him to fetch you something that requires him to go into the rain, and he will become ill. Mother nodded, looking at me. Her eyes held a greater sadness than I had seen at any time since her husband died. There was horror there as well, and guilt. Not at the death of an invader, but at the death of the innocence that had once been mine. I kept my own eye strong with purpose to let her know I accepted this duty as I had accepted the other strange duties that had come my way. At this, the complex of emotions in her eyes became too convoluted for me to follow even with our more than natural closeness. I fancied I saw gratitude there, and perhaps even more respect than had been typically present. But it may have been more sadness or a recognition of her own duty. The next day dawned bright and clear as though an omen for our quest. The roads were passable for carriages at that time of year, so we would be able to travel in some comfort. Mother had prepared us that morning with a most careful bathing session. We were shaved closely in all areas that would be inaccessible once our journey began. Special oils and lotions were kneaded into that soon-to-be covered skin. I was as comfortable as I had been since my masquerade began, just before she once again locked the device behind me. It took us 4 days to get there. My comfort level had fallen dramatically. Julia and I helped each other in ways that were too intimate for sisters, let alone a man and a woman. Even lovers would not be forced to take part in necessities so basic, so crudely undignified. It was not an opportunity for closeness even as we were forced into total dependence. North Vale was headquartered in a much more compact manor house than Stalwart Guard. We were given the best accommodations in the entire castle, adjacent rooms. I saw evidence of items recently removed when I was directing Mina in where to put my personal belongings, so I knew our chamber had not been idle. Whom have we displaced? I asked my servant. Trust her to have already developed informal information sources. Baron Spencer and his wife, Pamela. And where have they gone? They have displaced in turn their eldest daughter. And to answer your next question, the two daughters are now sharing a room. Well, at least everyone has a bed. I sighed as I tried to rub an itch that was hopelessly locked away. Your pardon, Highness, but that's not so. The bed in young Lady Alyssa's room, the eldest daughter, is too small for the Baron of North Vale. He has had a pallet of blankets prepared on the floor. Similarly, Lady Alyssa will sleep on the floor of her sister's room. In this entire castle, is there only this one large bed? I asked, running my hands over the sumptuous quilt. No, Highness, there are several. Milady Julia has another in her room, and I am sure that some other families have larger beds as well. The Baron did not want to displace more families, though. I looked at Mina, who looked back with innocence too complete to be real. Very well, Mina. Go tell Julia. Then ask the Baron if I might have a moment of his time. Please subscribe for the next part and visit my Patreon page for early access. Thanks.